So not only the subject, but also the whole idea of my presentation is more like a proposal or brainstorming that I have been doing for the last month on a specific case study of the Dürrnberg. And I am assuming almost that most people here actually know more about that archaeological site and that context than myself. As Thomas mentioned before, really my background is in other subjects, in other archaeological cases, so not really so much either in mining archaeology or in even European archaeology. But I do try to apply my background and my perspective. I will mention some of the background elements that I'm bringing in. And hopefully also it's suggestive to the reform colloquium in general, also in relation to the earlier talk, which I think while I was listening, I actually got a very surprising moment that was actually quite related to some of the ideas that I'm thinking here for modeling this case study. So I need to select here. Okay. So the outline of my presentation will be quite brief. I try to organize here on the terms of the question and the approach that I'm having in this case. The case study itself is really just a summary. Is not. I didn't went to the detail because I'm assuming also that we are not here for discussing the archaeology, but also more about the question itself in light of this case. I will mention my methodology, both in terms of what I'm bringing in, but also the idea that I'm starting through this case. And finally, the conceptual model or the elements that I'll be trying to use here with agent-based modeling. But at this stage is really the conceptual map of what it is in the literature already, mostly from people present in this room, but also some ideas that I'm bringing in from specifically from my perspective on archaeology and anthropology. So in terms of questioning approach, I think here is where I try to wrap it up some of the key concepts that we have been using in reform, and of course not specifically on my own. It's after a recent paper by Thomas Stoner, but also this idea, of course, is embedded in the approach itself that I use in simulation and agent-based modeling. So it's really something that it's beyond the kind of broad perspective, theoretical perspective on the use of resources by societies. And the idea here is the geo-resourcescapes. Of course, I added here the resourcescapes, something more general, but the idea here is that the focus on extractive resources, so the sources that we are really extracting and they are not renewed in terms of biology. And the idea here of the entanglement is related to the fact that you have social practices and those conditions that are in the environment, both biological and in this case, the mineral resource. But the idea here is that they are completely related. They are related in a way that is really indissociable. So you cannot really define the system without touching all those parts. And then from the system thinking perspective, which is really what I'm actually accustomed to rationalizing on the case studies, is the fact that we have here a system that is so close together and has this kind of situations where you have diffuse causality or multi-causality. You have several things that are actually affecting or are influencing another event, another aspect. And that is diffuse, not in a way of like a metaphorical way, but it's actually, you can actually demonstrate those causality links. For example, if you have cases where you don't have it, so you can use, for example, statistical reference to actually demonstrate something is a factor or not. So here I'm not talking just on how you conceptualize, but also in the fact that you can actually understand data in that sense also. And also feedback loops, which is something very proper of system thinking, is the idea that you really have an event or a factor that is actually affecting with some delay itself. So not all, of course, affecting several other things, but at the end, at some point, we will come back this effect and change the condition. And more importantly here, we are talking also when it is so entangled, when you understand those phenomena in a way that's so integrated, it's really hard to actually talk about an economy. So here I'm kind of using my background that I have from my past actually, from Salins, Marshall Salins and Karl Polanyi. I think at least most of you will probably know these references. And what I mean here is that from this perspective, although we are modeling focus on certain aspects that we will not generally understand as economic, here we are talking about something that really goes beyond the definition of economic. So the question here is about we are actually interested in defining the mechanism. So these arrows with nodes that I put it as an example here is we're actually thinking in terms of mechanisms. You have a series of factors and the consequences of those factors and the whole system, factors and the relationship between them are forming a whole. And the whole is actually a mechanism, and in a whole system you can have several mechanisms. And this definition of mechanism, I'm also thinking, taking from my background with Juan Barceló from University Autónoma Barcelona and some of my sociology professors. And this is really a kind of an approach that tries to go from the more generic social theory to the case study through this middle range theory, and also combining with the perspective that we can call it here system thinking or complex science also. So they have several branches of thought that are actually thinking in terms of emergence. So you have complexity that is emerging from certain interactions. So it's not really prescribed into the rules, for example, of something, but it's actually the formation afterward. Sorry. So the question here involves identifying the factors itself. So before we are mentioning, okay, we can identify those through data statistically, even qualitatively. You can try to define, to measure, etc. But really here, the point is about what is actually finally affecting the phenomena that you want to observe in the system. So really factors related to this. And related to the factor itself, what are the factors? Can we separate those factors that we relate into the sustainability of this system? So coming back, the geo-resource scapes, how you sustain really this phenomena, how you intensify the phenomena. So of course that's related to emergence, both of them, but you understand here that something is really growing and some factors will just push the growth and another push stability. And then finally also the possibility of collapse obliteration of the system, what is driving it to go down in a very generic sense, so diminishing activity, unrelating things that are related, etc. So here it is still abstract, but it's just in a matter of approach in relation also to the other case studies. These are the main questions that we will be approaching. As I mentioned before, my perspective is coming from this middle range theory approach, because basically with simulation we do need to define things and to attack a case study. So it's really hard to, you can do toy models, what they call in simulation, but here you really need to concretize, for example, the factors and the mechanisms that you are trying to model. And also we are joining this approach with, of course, prehistoric archaeology. So not archaeology in general, but actually prehistoric archaeology, which brings this opportunity, which could be the stronger assumption that is a pristine emergence. So something that is not just copied or influenced by outside. So it's actually in that regional instance, if you want, locally, it's emerging from there, from the internal dynamics. Also, of course, this assumption is related to the less density in terms of social interaction, in terms of even cultural complexity in certain aspects. So if you think about globalization phenomena, of course, in prehistory, we can be more or less far from this. And also you need to think on terms of intensity and velocity. So here we are talking about, of course, things affect eventually something else throughout the old world at least. But the point here is actually that we can analyze in relation to individual scales a phenomena that is quite like it won't affect the locality in a long time again. So it's really a very slower dynamic in comparison to nowadays trade in between nations, for example. So archaeology also brings this long durée, so related to this this longer time scale. But it's also necessary to a point that archaeology really brings this long durée in an unmatched scale relation to history and social sciences. So from my experience also in social science, it's really, even in theoretical terms, sometimes it's very hard to grasp how you can place a social phenomena at the archaeological scale, which also brings one of the caveats of applying archaeology through that approach, that of course we have a large distance between what you're proposing as a mechanism and the actual evidence, because archaeological evidence is aggregated, is referred to long periods, are small samples of larger phenomena. We don't really have individual data as a census, for example. So all those kind of things in archaeology, of course, becomes a limitation, not necessarily an obstacle. And also related to that, but beyond really just the distance between evidence and mechanism, you have certain reliance on indirect written sources. In our case, we will see, of course, it's Iron Age. You have is in the lineal of the historical or historically documented periods. So you have accounts from, in this case, Greeks and Romans about peoples that we are studying, but not from themselves. So that is also an important distinction that we need to always make in archaeology, on prehistoric archaeology. And of course, parallels, both archaeological, so other places, other archaeological data that is comparable, but also ethnographic and ethnohistoric. And that's, I just highlight that this is a caveat. It's not really a criticism, because I'll be throwing stones in my own ceiling. The idea here is that we just need to be really aware of those limitations. And of course, we do know what didn't happen, or lots of things that didn't happen in terms of archaeological evidence. And also in terms of social mechanisms, we do know that certain mechanisms or certain scenarios under certain mechanisms are basically very improbable, impossible. So we can exclude certain things and focus on certain other things. Finally, which is very related to us in Reform here in the colloquiums, is really how applicable are the lessons that we are taking from this past, where we have georesourcescapes, but are quite different from the present day georesourcescapes, and can we just bring it to the present and future? What we should do with this information, or this line of research to actually bring it to the future? And this, of course, for all that are actually archaeological in the room, you do know that this is always a question, a limitation, when you're actually talking outside archaeology, presenting it and saying, okay, how I convince others that what I do is relevant or is something that is actually can serve for the future. And I leave it open, this question, because I don't really have an answer. I just believe that it is important. And of course, from the theoretical perspective, we try to apply the same framework. No? So it's basically from the same point, start point. So finally, just brushing some of the ideas of the case study. So we are talking here about rock salt georesource scale, so mining of rock salt in the northeastern Austria or Alps, and it's really about two archaeological sites. Those archaeological sites are in the core area in terms of cultural and also archaeological studies in this area. And then, of course, they have the particularity of being sources or documented sources of rock salt in prehistory. The big advantage of this case studies is a well-studied archaeological, or both of them are well-studied archaeological sites, specifically Dürrnberg, and we have the work from Thomas Turner and also Nicole and others here. So there is a lot of information about this case study. As I said, the importance itself is that it's a core area for a wider and far-reaching archaeological culture. So we are talking about the Hallstatt, but also Latin is related. And if, well, I'll show you a map later on for those that are not archaeologists to see really the scope of that culture and how those sites are really perceivable as potential central places. And of course, the particularity of rock salt also brings certain limitations in terms of interpretation. This is a quite specific resource. It is a resource that is used from way before, but here in this period and in Europe is specifically exploited in a more systematic way through mining. And the idea here is that, of course, we do have to account for that in terms of interpreting how we can extrapolate conclusions about this real resource scape in comparison to, for example, metals or even bioresources. No? So, and more importantly here, also in terms of interpretation, we can relate this case study to a larger question, or maybe a more interesting question for some, that it's about changes, social change proper, and the idea of development of social hierarchy, for example, or even the sustainability of that social hierarchy. Remember, we are talking the marginal moment just before Roman period. We are talking about a certain context that is not, in my perspective, is not Neolithic. So we do have a strong argument for social hierarchy, although the terms of that social hierarchy is not quite clear. Here, just as an overview, you can see I taken this from Wiki Commons, so take it with a pinch of salt. So we do have, like, this is kind of a broad scope. This is archaeological culture, so it's the distribution of that, the traits of that culture around Europe, and in combination with the Latin, which presumably has other core areas. But you can see here that most of the Europe is actually at least culturally connected. We don't really know at what level they were socially connected, but in terms of culture, we can document connection between them. And the dates for this period, in case you were wondering, because I'm talking about that, but of course, assuming that most of you know the historical time of the Iron Age in this area is. You have here the dating for Hallstatt and Dürrnberg, and you can see that more or less is scoping much after the dates from the exploitation of copper, but basically the idea that you have documentation on Hallstatt for the first time back up to the first and second millennium BC, but the real intensification and the beginning of the Dürrnberg site is much later and is really concentrated in a few centuries before BC. No, so a few less than half of the millennia, and has an idea here about the site itself, which will be focusing on Dürrnberg. We have a developing situation. It's not a very simple projection, but at least we do see phases. And it's after a clear beginning, you do have a phase of intensification. This phase of intensification has more or less a time range. With exceptions, you have not a constant grow and degrow, but you can definitely say, for example, that Dürrnberg, for example, survives a period of general crisis in that region, while Dürrnberg actually survives Hallstatt, and the exploitation of salt continues throughout that period. So we can maybe think about here in terms of resilience of that salt economy in relation to the neighboring Hallstatt. And you can also see here, I put this map, I modified with the permission of the authors, but I modified those maps just to try to visualize it in a linear way. So you have, even don't knowing the exact periods, you can see that the time goes in this direction. And there is like a more intensification in the middle. And then also we have two nucleus of settlements, which is the mining area itself, where we actually have the mine shafts and galleries, and then you have the village, which is near the river. Oh, sorry. Well, I repeated the map here, but it's just for you to understand that the influence of those sites is really beyond the discotheque. That's okay. So the importance of that core area goes far beyond, or at least quite beyond the sites themselves and the immediate hinterlands. So they actually connect quite evidently through archaeology with the northern part of the Alps and also the southern other aspects, but mainly in terms of immediate contact through the northern Alps and also, of course, as I mentioned before, the culture itself of those regions of a constant interaction, at least in longer time period throughout Europe. So just for you to understand that we are talking here about those sites, but really it's about this larger phenomena that can influence other sites, no? Other regions also. So the methodology that I will be using here is combining, is basically, we can summarize it as simulation of socio-environmental system, also named socio-ecological systems. This is a quite specific approach to apply to modern period, or modern also mainly to modern periods, but were quite adopted by archaeologists, and specifically archaeologists involved in simulation. When you are talking about this kind of systems, you are talking basically from the perspective of joining in social and biophysical, meaning that we have both those life-related aspects, but also the mineral, the weather, for example. So you have all those elements together in a coherent system. You have multiple scales, so you do have those kind of processes that are happening in different velocity, feedbacks that are coming back in different velocities, so you do have certain complexity on that level. And we have this concept related to this perspective, which is the complex adaptive system that views any new phenomena as an emergence. So the idea is that you don't predefine the system. It's not that the system is defined by itself ad infinitum to do something, but it's actually the iteration of certain processes create emergence of the phenomena as a self-organizing phenomena. So the idea here is that it's completely endogenous, or you're not assuming the right system. No? So basically, if something comes out of a site, for example, we need to think regionally to actually be able to explain in terms of emergence. And you probably heard about this other concept, the adapted cycle. It's coming from Halling, and it's quite influent in several disciplines. He had some kind of strange history, so we went pseudoscience at some point. So just take care of what you read about it, but basically here is within this context, and of course Halling originally was intending to approach it through this perspective. And the idea of simulation, we do need simulation to approach it this perspective, basically because we are talking about a process that only through iteration, will generate the phenomena. So we cannot really demonstrate that using a more classical mathematical modeling, so the one that you solve it by hand if you want. This mathematical approach, which was used and can be used, of course, quite widely, cannot quite be used in that approach because you cannot really solve all the potential scenarios here. So you really need to iterate this phenomena, and which is really simulate. So, and the idea here also is that we're not just modeling in terms of mathematics, we're actually formalizing something that we called before mechanism. So it's really about explanation, not so much just, for example, trying to find a pattern with data or as you can do in statistics. Here we're talking really about representing a phenomenon in terms of meaningful terms, and then seeing the consequences of those phenomena that we are embedding in the model. No? So, and more importantly, we are here talking also about social simulation. So even though we are approaching social, environmental, ecological systems, the key here, of course, for us, will be social mechanism and not so much biophysical explanations of those changes. And that is actually a quite established field that's called social simulation and has many applications and many researchers actually engage in a whole conference. So it's really quite a development area outside archaeology. And of course, here we're talking about various aims. So there are models that are explanatory and simulation models about social mechanisms, but they can also be just targeting theory building, hypothesis testing, even prediction or visualization. So for example, you have cases, I think at least few of you know of pedestrian models that are kind of a social simulation model, but have very, very simple social mechanism. So for example, the earth movements, all this kind of phenomena, it's the same idea, but it's quite reduced to the most simple. So it's a behavior that is modeled in that way that, of course, for us is not so interesting. It's interest, but it's not so interesting in terms of relating to archaeological evidence. So coming to agent-based modeling, for those that you don't know about this methodology, we are talking here about modeling at several layers of information. So, of course, the core of the agent-based modeling is the agent. We are talking about modeling different parts of a phenomena, which is normally coming up to a population of entities. Has a focus on agency in a more deep term in some cases, but not always. So we can actually have, for example, agent-based modeling in physics as particle dynamics, which is technically is the same, but of course here we are talking about agents in a more deep terms in terms of social theory, you know. So and also has a great potential for social dynamics, and that potential has been explored a lot. And here you have an example that is using, for example, GIS layers together with social mechanisms, so modeling of those agents together with other dynamics that are not necessarily social, for example, water flow. No? So you have these kind of models that are, for the eyes outside, is probably, oh, there are so many things here happening. So that is also one of the attractiveness and the retractiveness, if I can say, of agent-based modeling. So it does impose a lot because you're adding a lot of information in the same simulation. And just to highlight here also that in archaeology, it's also quite established, maybe not so established in terms of having a whole simulation conference about it, but we do have a long list of bibliography and research projects dedicated specifically to this approach, and have been applying to things from trades up to sedimentation. So really in quite large variety of applications. Fortunately, also for that case study, we do have a previous example of application for salt mining in Hallstatt, using agent-based modeling, and it was quite recent, relatively recent, and is more or less between 2000, a bit earlier than 2010 up to 2015. The work done by Kovarik and Wurzel, and here I just highlighted Gabriel Wurzel is the modeling person, if you want. So, and that is also quite important because I saw after the professional trajectory going towards, of course, towards a professional application, which is also something that maybe I didn't mention, but it's quite strong also for example, modeling industrial process and all kind of things that actually are applied directly and not for research necessarily. And in his case, for example, he's doing right now research, but on architecture. So really went outside this area. But you can also see the imprint of this approach into the work done there in Hallstatt. They try to focus on a progressive modeling methodology where you do go from the mining shaft, the dynamics in the mining shaft up to the regional scale. They use multiple models, so they actually did different models, not a single one that covers everything, and designed several experiments, really quite large material in terms of modeling. You see here, for example, there are only a few examples, but they did a lot of work on that sense. They did have some interesting results, at least in my view. They had some insights about the mining logistics. They realized, for example, that they were modeling a transporter, and the transporter might not really be necessary because of the different rhythm of exploitation of a mining work and the transporter. So because of the amount of salt actually extracted. So they really did work on the calculations of how much time, how much labor is related inside the mining gallery in shaft. Also the formation of mining galleries, the shapes, because they are modeling different salt distributions in the soil, for example, and then getting this Asian dynamic extracting the salt and then seeing how the gallery evolves. And also they did lesser experiments, so not so much the focus of what they did. They did on the general demographics using a hybrid approach with system dynamics model, which I won't enter here, but it's a simpler way of modeling compared to ABM. And unfortunately, at least from outside, I see that it's a truncated work plan, so they projected more work, but they didn't quite sustain the whole plan that they had. And then I can actually say by my experience that's quite normal when doing simulation, because you have, for example, projects of 5 years maximum, and then the whole plan is actually always multidisciplinary, and a teamwork. So it really involves more than, for example, a PhD thesis. So you really need to have continuity. But it's still the work, it's quite useful. And here just mentioning briefly that, as Thomas bring it up, I did some work on food economy in villages during the industrialization. So the focus here was the sustainability of the food economy, and particularly on relation to the urbanization process happening in the industrialization. And how it could not be sustained in certain conditions of, especially climate conditions, but also the hydrological system itself. And here the important part is really to highlight that I use a modular approach. So it's really a progression from different parts of that model up to an integrated model, and that's done progressively. And also to highlight that it's is still under development, or rather integration, but it's really a process that has been producing a lot of outcome and really a lot of discussions with the other researchers related to the industrialization. Also mentioning all the other line of work that I have been doing that is related in terms of giving an opportunity of getting actually new modules for creating Asian-based models. It's a library that it's formed by a network that most of the researchers doing Asian-based modeling archaeology are involved. And we are doing an online platform. But basically, it will be growing during this year a lot and giving us and others the opportunity of actually using those modules to create more complex models, but still with this kind of firm foot on previous work. So to give a brief idea of what I've been thinking about this case study is, so basically we are using a similar approach from the one, for example, applied to Hallstatt, but with the important distinction that we will be focusing more on the settlement and regional scale. So if you remember this idea that they started from the shaft and they arrived up to the village with the demographic dynamics, but here really because of the questions, but also because they did that work already. And we do have more information about the settlement and the region. We are using this opportunity to actually go beyond and model beyond this local settlement. And more importantly, identify the scenarios and factors that really give the formation of the geo-resourcescapes. In the case of Hallstatt, that have basically assumed that mining existed, that mining was interested to do, that there were miners. So all of those things were assumptions of the models, of course, because they were investigating the dynamics inside. But here we will be more interesting on how it actually can attract the economical interest, if you want, of households, local households. And in that sense, also attack the case study of Hallstatt in that sense. So because Hallstatt is a mirror of Dürrnberg, being in the same region, but also possibly related in terms of continuity. And in the case of also Dürrnberg brings this scenario of we can actually model, for example, social dynamics in the local settlements, see if this incentive for mining is actually driven by exchange, trade, or maybe, and it's quite democratic, but or either is driven by social political relationships. And the idea is also that we can actually cover all those areas through the modeling approach. So it's not impossible to do a more holistic model, even though not always is desirable, but in this case, really we'll be attacking a question that's at least from the perspective of an archaeologist and anthropologist and sociologist, is quite indistinguishable. So you cannot really attack one question without touching the others here. Of course, the level of detail of modeling those aspects will be really dependent on how ready we have a module on that available, but also what the effects. We can do experiments actually to measure if changing those modules affect at all the result, then we can actually simplify the model. And here, just giving a brief example, is really about the conceptualization of how we can formalize this kind of complexity of relationships. Has agent-based modeling, that's not really surprising. The entities here will be households. So households in terms of, well, defined really by Salins back a long time ago. So the idea is not really about families or not houses also. So it's just a domestic unit where you have cohabitation and production consumption in this case. So you have a series of activities happening and coordination to each other. And of course, those individuals are possibly and quite probably related by kinship. Then you have work teams. That idea of work teams has a modeling methodology, has also been used by Wilkinson in Mesopotamia for work teams related to agriculture. And it's quite a useful way of modeling this kind of process, especially if you are not just prescribing the activity itself. No? So you have an interest of the household that will search if it's interested or not, like bid for a work team to happen or not, and that work team will actually deal with the activity. And land units has a basis, has an opportunity of using GIS data and other kind of related spatial data that we can actually use to calibrate and validate the model. And the activity, I detail more about the activities here because it's really a concept that is potentially theory building in this model, because we will be able to really define key elements that are needed to perform this model without, of course, adding too much complexity to it. But in this case was where the idea with Stefan Mullerheim actually connected with the text on the day of the use of resources during a day. Here, the idea will be that you have different types of materials. So those materials can be either inputs or outputs of the activities. And of course, through the commitment of labor from the work teams, and some requirements, qualitative and quantitative requirements for that activity to happen, those materials will be recombined. So every time activity happens, it gets certain materials and recombined into others, and those might be consumed directly or consumed through activity. So the whole idea here is become quite complex, but it's still modular. So those activities will be a list of maybe 10 activities. We do have information on, am I meaning here from metalworking to carpentry, wood cutting, at that level of detail, because the template of those activities is actually quite simple. So it really becomes a recombinatory problem instead of a descriptive problem of the activity itself. And to just talk about the other aspects, I just highlighted a few of the aspects that I foresee to be quite easy to actually use ready modules from outside. So demography, I myself have a module, but I know several modules actually dealing with this in quite high detail. So at the individual level with age, gender, marriage status, all these kind of things, and then can calibrate it with demographic dynamics. Political relationships, and meaning here political relationships are alliances and tribute, all this kind of dynamics, not necessarily like a state formation, but this kind of power relationships, prestige accumulation, all those mechanisms are quite experience in archaeology in terms of modeling. So there are quite a few examples for using here. And household behavior also through the idea of mainly reinforced learning. So we'll not go through maybe a more detailed agent here, but at least this idea of a reactive, active in terms of taking decision-making depending on the conditions and being able to modify preferences in order to do better in the next iteration. And in a broader view, so that information was more about the design to be of the model, but here the idea is more about the experimentation that we can do with such a model. More importantly, the focus here will be always on what's the drivers of the salt economy or the rock salt economy. And of course, thinking about alternative scenarios or mechanisms that we can play in this model. Also, in the same model, use the several conditions. And I just, of course, thinking about the literature, but also on other more generic literature, I can really think about at least 3 options here. So we have that sound mining is actually sustained, emerging and sustained by basically a completely decentralized process where households just are motivated to do that, at least for a fraction of time. They extract some gain from that and they just keep doing it more and more. You have another option where you actually have certain households, so the elite here, that are able to influence the other households, and they can influence the others indirectly, asking for tribute, and that tribute will put some pressure over households to do something and to, for example, use the opportunity of the salt itself. And finally, we have the other option, which is the idea that maybe those specific households were actually planning the activity itself, especially in the case of Dürrnberg. And in that sense, they were actually initiating work teams. They are organizing the other households. They are claiming their labor has a tribute, of claiming, for example, the salt itself or other materials. And I'm sorry, and of course, the keywords for this experimentation of the model is always from the emergence, the sustainability, and the intensification or collapse of that phenomena. So really, we are thinking in terms of scenarios of how we define basically the conditions for something to grow, something to continue, or something to intensify or fail. So. Yeah, and hopefully,